Good morning. One more talk on expressionism, and it's not the last one, by the way. We'll have some later on because this is one of the movements that lasted all the way to the present. And so this is one of the longest lived um, movement that started in the early 20th century. So before we move into expressionism, I want, as this is Picasso in his time, I want to show you where Picasso stands at that very period. And so he is at that time dabbling with Cubism, which will start, by the way, in 2 weeks. So here's one of his works, and we'll go at length on the process of that led to Cubism. This is analytic cubism, and then he did what he called synthetic cubism with just a lot of way he puts things together, sometimes different texture, collage, what we call collage very often. So this is where Picasso stands when the Expressionist movement starts in Germany. And last time we saw Die Brücke, which is the bridge. That was literally that bridge between, there's a problem with that, yeah. Die Brücke, which is that transition between what the academy was doing. And they're trying to go back to works that were done before without having that stifling effect of the academy. So Die Brücke lasted for a while and then was kind of replaced, but it's a different location, by Der Blaue Reiter, which is the Blue Rider, which we're going to concentrate on today. But before then, we have to look at what's happening in Germany, because this is one of the main causes of all these changes. The whole life is changing all over Europe. And we see almost all at the same time at the end of the 19th century in France. And but it happens in Italy, it happens in Germany, it happens in England, where the academy has become so rigid, giving a very good technical basis for the work. But as far as in inspiration, they completely smother any inspiration, personal inspiration by the painter. And so they revolt, a lot of them revolt. And the one that didn't, we don't even know their names anymore because they got completely forgotten, even if they were technically very good. So in Germany, what happens is that in 1871, finally, all that multitude of states that existed under the flag of German states, if you want, get together and form what we now know as Germany, the Republic, but at that time became an empire under the helm of Wilhelm I, who was previously King of Prussia. Wilhelm had named Bismarck as Chancellor of Germany, the equivalent of Prime Minister. And in fact, Bismarck had almost everything to say. He did some good things, but he did some very difficult things. And a lot of Germans left Germany at that time, including my great-grandfather, who moved to Belgium because he resented the very military profile of the government at that time. Wilhelm had a tremendous ambition. He wanted Paris. That was easy. He absolutely loved Paris, was jealous of the existence of Paris, and he wanted it in a way or another. And he had some hopes with the First World War. But so Berlin became its capital. Then we have in 1882, we have the Triple Alliance, which was a secret agreement between Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Followed by, of course, the reaction to that. Alliances concluded by Brittany, France, and Russia. Of course, they don't talk about Belgium, but it's there too. It's just a very small country, so they don't. In 1884, Germany finally acquired some colonies. It was one of the last main European countries to get colonies. The others had already been distributed about 10 years before. And so they got German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, Togoland and Cameroon, and then later New Guinea and German Micronesia and so on in the Pacific.
The screen is not changing.
Sorry. Oh, sorry, I didn't. No, it's my fault. Thank you, Jan. Where is it? It has to go there. Okay, sorry. Thank you very much. But then the big event, of course, is the 28th of June, 1914, is the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. That is causing the start of World War I. And you say, how can just an assassination start such a big war? It happened that Austria reacted right away against the Serbs who were responsible for the assassination, followed by the German states. But Serbia was under the protection of Russia, so Russia reacted. And France was the ally to Russia. And so they reacted together with Russia against Austria and Germany, and that started the whole thing. As you know, UK then joined, and much later on, the US. And that was unfortunately that terrible war where millions of people died and were maimed and wounded, suffered from gas contamination in the trenches. So it was really painful war. 1919, the Treaty of Versailles that formalized, if you want, the conditions of the rendition of Germany. And as we know, in retrospect, was much too harsh and caused actually the World War II. But anyway, the Treaty of Versailles then was followed by the Weimar Republic. Germany lost 13% of its territory and all of its colonies. In 1921, the worldwide Great Depression hit not only the US and the Western Europe, but also Germany. And there is there a big problem because they were borrowing money from France. They had to reimburse France for certain things, and that was inflated. And so they were really completely desperate for any revenues. And so this is what slowly brought Hitler at the helm of the German state. So 1930 policy of fiscal austerity and deflation, high unemployment, about 30%, which is huge, by 1932. And so the Nazi party led by Adolf Hitler won the special federal election. And by the 30th of January 33, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. In 1933, the Enabling Act gave Hitler unrestricted legislative power. This is also very important as far as art is concerned. We talked about it earlier, about the Entartete Kunst, the degenerate art that Hitler was so angry about. He thought that all that new art that was coming, and that's including all the art we're going to see today, was not worthy of German people. And he really led the policy for a long time to really get rid of that art, not only destroy it or sell it to people outside of the country. And so a lot of the people we're going to see today lost an enormous amount of the art that they produced during that period because it was burned, literally, or destroyed. And so the same thing with the first expressionists that we saw before. So let's look again at that timeline of all the movements. So as you can see, Expressionism that starts in 1905 still runs on this year. There's still artists that call themselves Expressionists. And we'll see what these things are. Die Brücke stopped at the beginning of in 1913, so just before the First World War. And the Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider, lasted until 1914 also. The very good reason is once the war took place, either they died during the war or they moved to France or to other countries. And so that dismantled the movement. And then this is what we will see in the coming weeks, Cubism, the first analytic cubism and then synthetic cubism, together also with futurism, suprematism, and constructivism. That will be early December. So what is the Blauheiter about? First of all, it grouped a series of artists that were united in rejection of the Neue Künstlervereinigung of Munich. So that was that society, if you want, of artists in Munich that wanted to remain rather traditional and that were praising the regime and the generals and all the high level society. And so they didn't care for that. It was made of Russian immigrants like Vasily Kandinsky, Alexei von Jalensky, Marianne von Verhefkin, and German artists like Franz Marc, August Macke, and Gabriele Münter. Inspiration was really interesting. They go back to the old Gothic period that they consider as theirs. They were very much believer of the Gothic period. So European medieval art and primitivism. Again, primitivism is what comes out of Africa or the oceanic arts. Africa, because suddenly Germany had some colonies in Africa. So the result is we see art coming from these colonies to the country. They're also looking at contemporary non-figurative art scene in France. And they very much influenced by Cézanne, the later part of Cézanne's work, where his art becomes goes from just looking at nature into planes and almost the beginning of Cubism, if you look at it. It's also interesting that we have to realize, it's difficult to imagine, they didn't know exactly what was happening in France at the time. It's only when there are exhibitions that happen in Munich or in Dresden or whatever, then suddenly they bring Cézanne and some Impressionist painters and say, oh, wow, this is so different to what we do. And then suddenly they have also some new ideas. So their ideal is promotion of modern art, a common desire to express spiritual truths through their art. They and particularly Kandinsky has tremendous spiritual ideas. And so the idea that their spiritual world is going to be expressed through art. Connection, again, very much Kandinsky, between visual art and music. He's a firm believer of that, and we'll try to understand how. Spiritual and symbolic association of colors. Again, Kandinsky wrote treatises just on that subject. You can find them online. It's still in print. And then spontaneous, intuitive approach to painting. So let's look at that major figure of the early 20th century. Vasily Kandinsky, written with a V or a W, up to you. His real name was Vasily Vasilyevich Kandinsky, was born in Moscow in 1866, and he studies law. You know, he wants a real job, and at least the parents want. That's a typical thing. So he studies law in Moscow and then travels to the Vologda region, part of an ethnographic research group with buildings. And when you look at the old houses in Russia, they painted in red and in yellow, in green, in blue. It's so different to our grayish or whitish type of architecture. At that time, it's vibrant. It's really amazing. And so he's stunned by this. He marries his cousin in 1892 and will divorce her in 1911. But by 1896, he realizes that painting is really what he wants to do. So he gives up teaching law and economics to enroll in the Munich Academy. And he helps to found the Neue Vereinigung in Munich, the Munich New Artist Association, that unfortunately is not going to go where he wants to go. In 1911, he forms a new group, the Blue Rider. And this was a difficult moment. They were very serious about forming that group. It took a couple of years to gather enough people and have enough ideas to make it a solid thing. But unfortunately, very quickly, in 1914, at the onset of World War I, Kandinsky goes back to Russia via Switzerland and Sweden, and there he teaches form and color analysis. He meets Nina Andreevskaya in 1916, and she will die in 1980. In 1921, he is invited to attend the Bauhaus of Weimar by his founder, Walter Gropius. And we'll talk about the Bauhaus at the end of the talk. A very important movement that still has some successors nowadays, but that was trying to explain that architecture is not just a building, but should be linked to all the arts that go into it too. So to the decoration of the house or the building, the furniture, the decoration. And so they had teachers there that were teaching sculpture, that were teaching painting, design and everything beside architecture. He gave a basic design class and then advanced theory. And again, as I say, if you're interested, there are multiple books written by Kandinsky that are still in print and quite interesting. He gave then classes and workshop on color theory, which was really what he was about, with new elements of form psychology. And so in 1923, he forms the Blaue Vier, the Blue Four, with Klee, Feininger, and Jalensky. So it's a different group. And lectures and exhibition will be given in the US in 1924. In 1933, at the arrival of Hitler, of course, the Bauhaus is dissolved. And he moves to Paris. And that's, again, the effect of Hitler. This was much too different. He didn't care for that independent movement. He wanted everything to report to him. Kandinsky moves to Paris. He works in the living room studio from 34 to 44. And we'll see how his art is changing biomorphic forms, color composition, and evoking Slavic popular art. Of course, that's also part of his heart. In 1944, he will die in Neuilly-sur-Seine, which is just around Paris. All the works still in possession were donated to the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris, so it has a very large collection of Kandinsky. What is really interesting is the influences. In 1896, and we'll talk a little more because I'm going to show you one of these paintings, he saw an exhibition of paintings by Monet, where the color was almost independent of the object themselves. And we'll discuss it because I'd never thought of that. And when you look at it, you will understand better. So I'm going to limit it there. He also listened to Richard Wagner, Lohengrin, and is stunned by the extreme lyricism of Wagner. And this is not the first time we talk about the effect of Wagner on artists. His music was so much on top of every other as far as volume and coloring and so on. So that was really a shock for him. Then there's an interesting lady, Madame Blavatsky, who was one of the leaders of Theosophy, which was telling that creation is a geometrical progression beginning with a single point. And when you look at the abstract art by Kandinsky, you see often that point and that line that departs. That comes from there. Another point, and to tell you the intellect of Kandinsky, in 1897, there is an experimental proof of the existence of electrons. And up to then, there was the idea that the atom was indivisible or whatever, couldn't be divided. And so suddenly that thing that seems so solid is broken apart, and they say, no, there is smaller things within the atom. So suddenly he doubts science, and that really shakes his concept of reality. So realize what was happening in that head. You know, he had so many concerns, so many interests. So this, even the condemns positivism and its equivalent in pictorial art, which was naturalist, which was the thing that Kandinsky had seen in Russia. At the time he came to Germany, the only paintings he had seen in Russia was very realistic and naturalist. So part of his publication is the Blue Rider Almanac, and on this spiritual in art, in 26 point and line to plane, and there's multiple other publication he did on color and theory of color. So now look at this painting by Monet. And imagine Kandinsky has never seen a haystack, because in Russia, this is not the way they harvest. And so he's in front of that. He doesn't know what these masses are. So for him, it's abstract. And he looks at the color, and for him, it's just a color that is independent of the shape. And all this works in his head, and he comes to that idea of abstraction. And when you look at it, you know what a haystack is. You've seen fields with haystacks. So immediately you identify, and it becomes a realist painting, if you want. But for him who didn't know, it's completely abstract. So let's look at the evolution of his art. So early pieces are very naturalistic. You have Odessa Port in 1898, very traditional type of painting. It's starting to change a little bit in 1901 with Akirtika, where you start seeing a certain abstraction in the shapes. And before I go on with this, I want to show you a place, because you're going to see that a lot of the art is stored in that museum. So it's the Lenbach house that was built at first as a Florentine-style villa for the painter Franz von Lenbach between 1887 and 1891. And then was expanded in the early 20th century, and again in 1969. Some of the rooms, by the way, have kept their original design. The city of Munich acquired the building in 1924 and opened the museum there in 1929. And then the latest wing was closed, the one that had been built in the early 20th century, because they expanded, and the result was that square, that cube that you see there to expand the building. And that museum reopened in May 2013. And so it's really famous for the collection painting of Der Blaue Reiter and some other expressionists, the paintings that were saved from Hitler. So we have that, this is really considered the most important painting from the first decade of the 1900s. It shows that cloaked figure on a speeding horse rushing through a meadow. And this is what will represent the Blue Rider later on. But though it was painted in 1903, it was taken back by him when he's in 1911, when they started the Blue Rider. So you see some, probably we can believe that these are cows or whatever, you know, grazing in the field there. But it's very much of a guesswork. You can see that it is a horse, but it's quite undefined, if you want. So the color is becoming more important. This was painted during his stay in Paris in 1907, and what he calls a colored drawing. And so you have all kind of people that are so you have more patches of color than faces and people that you can define if you want. Then later on he does Murnau, Dorfstrasse, so the village street in Murnau in 1908. And you see he's starting to take that Fauvist color that Matisse had brought in the Fauvist movement. The Fauvists have influenced also the early painters. The Blue Mountain, La Montagne Bleue. So we can see again how he's now stating the color is independent of the reality, if you want. This is really becoming what the Fauvists do, is apply the color that they feel, not that they see. And here we see that blue mountain and the vegetation around. We don't know what it really was, but he thought these colors were coming out really beautiful. And then you have the horses at the very front.
Yeah.
Yes.
Paint the color that you see?
No, you don't paint the color that you see. You paint the color that you feel.
Okay.
That's the expression,
Yeah.
the idea of expressionism. The independence from the form. Sure. And we see how more and more he's kind of leaving the reality and just starting to model a landscape like this just as shapes. So they're less rectilinear than Cézanne, but it's still the principle is the same. So this is supposed to represent landscape with factory chimney. And so you have indeed the big factory chimney there in red, but the rest is kind of a landscape. It's very round, very curvy linear. And finally, at the time he starts the Blue Rider, as we see that you just have a line that kind of suggests a shape, but you have spots of light, of colors all around the canvas. So here we know again, this is a rider. It's lyrical, but it's very much connected with music. The more and more he listens to music while he works, and that inspires him. And this is really interesting because one year we had a concert at my place and we projected one of the later painting by Kandinsky, and the pianist improvised a piece of music just by looking at the painting. So it was a reverse process. But just because certain colors were associated with certain notes. And so this is the way he would proceed. And it was an interesting event. So we're getting close. So imagine what Picasso is doing in France, what Kandinsky is doing there in Germany at the time, where Picasso is never going towards abstraction. He doesn't like abstraction. He considers that as soon as you put your brush on or your pen on the paper, you start something, there is something there. Whereas Kandinsky just evades from that, and we're going to see it becomes intersection of line and curvy linear forms, but they don't represent anything. As mentioned, he was extremely influenced by music, so he starts giving his name. The titles are musical terms, so you have improvisation and other titles we'll see in a minute. And so this becomes, though some people say there is always something happening in his painting, some reality. I don't always see it. Yeah, we can say maybe there is a fence there. There seem to be a kind of an animal, but we're not quite sure. Is that a mountain, or is it just a spot of color? The story goes to that he had a watercolor on his desk. And then when he left just the draft through the watercolor on the floor, and it turned around. And by the time he came back, because it was turned around, he couldn't see what it represented. And he liked it better than when he knew what it represented. So for him, the idea of just independent colors was more important. So picture with a black arch. So again, you have that big, it looks like St. Louis arch. But again, it's just a question of colors and some sound in his head. Composition 7. It's at the Tretiakov in Russia. Shows you again all that lyrical colors. Though some years ago, we had some of Kandinsky exhibited at the Phoenix Art Museum, and my disappointment was that the colors were not good. And it's very difficult to know if at that time did the pigment change with time. That can happen. But this is really singing. You can hear some music when you look at that. Once the tone goes down, it's much more difficult to see. So this is the most complex piece he ever painted. Then, as we mentioned, he returned to Russia between 14 and 21. And very quickly, I mean, not only was he sent to the Bauhaus, but he would have left anyway because his art didn't correspond to what the revolution wanted, which was something much more propagandist, showing real people and so on. So these they didn't care for either. So this is the fugue that he painted in 1914. And you can imagine some staccato, you know, with these lines here that could be represented in music. Then he joined, as we mentioned, he joined the Bauhaus, and he did that kind of painting focused on color still, but a little more constructed. And that could be with the influence of the Bauhaus, where he was with architects and others. So you have these more lines and curves or circles, a more defined geometry.
And
yes,
I remember that some of his colors or shapes reminded him of musical instruments.
Yes.
Yeah,
but it's mostly the sounds. It's really the sounds. And in his books on music, he associates certain notes with certain colors. And so this is part of it. But as you can see, this is much more structured than what we just saw before. And then here, this is another one a little later, this dated 1926, the several circles, number 323. And don't forget that thing of theosophy, that everything started with a point and then a line. And so this has a lot to do also with his psychological projection. And then finally, when he moved to Paris, it's what we call the great synthesis, where he is really trying to take back everything he did prior to Russia, during Russia, and during the Bauhaus, and did things that, as you can see now, we don't have just lines, but we have shapes that are filled with colors on often dark background. And this is part of the bunch of paintings that went to the Centre Pompidou in Paris. If you've never been there, it's that very, very modern building in the middle of a gorgeous 17th century neighborhood. So quite interesting. He died, as we said, in France. And it's, I think, always hard because when you come from a culture like Russia, which is quite interesting as far as the colors and the whole customs, and then went to Germany where he found that avant-garde series of people, and then he moved to Paris. Never met with Picasso. I was very curious to see because they lived in the same city for a long time, and they never met. So it's interesting. They had no interest in meeting. He didn't care for Cubism at all, and Picasso didn't care for abstract art. So that was putting them on different places. But extremely interesting. Kandinsky is considered the father of abstract art. And this was kind of a blemish on Picasso's side because he was not the father of something that was happening at the time. So moving to another figures, and these are the next two artists that never fully developed because they died very young, and they died during the war. He was born, Franz Marc was born in Munich in 1880. His father was an amateur landscape painter. So he started very young. You know, it's you are going around your father and you see him paint or whatever, and if you dabble with brushes, you can really see very quickly if you have any talent. So in 1900, he enrolled in the Munich Academy of Art, but again, he didn't care for the curriculum that was too traditional. So he was acquainted with the Jugendstil art movement around the turn of the century, and but that just inspired him to break from the confines of what he had learned at the academy. In 1903, he spent 6 months in Paris studying modern and impressionist paintings, and he met a French artist that was considered famous for his animal paintings. And so he was quite attracted to that. And he started depicting animals in his own painting as early as 1905. He returned to Paris in 1907, there he was struck by some painting. If you remember, in 1907, there was an exhibition of Van Gogh paintings, and that really shook him when he saw the just that completely different style than what he had seen before, with his use of color and the brushwork that was so different. He tried a little bit in Pontyism, but didn't care for it. And so finally he turned to the Fauves that were led by Matisse, and really cared for colors. And we'll see again how he dissociates the color with the form. And this is one of his early works there. He loves horses, he loves animals. He just spends a lot of time studying the anatomy of animals. And when he was living in Berlin, he would spend a lot of time in the zoo over there to look at animals, the way they were moving and their shapes. So no surprise to see that he's going to devote many of his paintings on horses and other animals. But as you can see, have you ever seen a blue horse? No, he's again kind of moving, just he adapts the color the way he feels, not at all the way the animal looks, but it's extremely powerful, and that purple and pink at the background is quite interesting too. He's known, this one is more known in Minneapolis, the large blue horses. Absolutely beautiful, just the interaction between the animals is quite nice. He's going to start a friendship in 1910 with the next artist we'll see, August Macke. And then he just goes on, as I mentioned, to paint animals. He's going to join the Blaureiter in 1911, and even will found the journal that goes with it. At that time, we see exhibition, by the way, in Berlin, Cologne, Hagen, and Frankfurt. So they definitely showed their work during that time. Here is the tiger, where you can see an influence of maybe Cubism that he must have seen a few. He met Robert Delaunay, who was one of the futurists in Paris at the time. And he's fascinated by futurism and Cubism. But you can see the eye of the tiger there. Then the style is changing with some curvy linear landscape, and the animals are not unified as we saw before. But there is definitely some influence of Cubism in that painting in 1913. It's been missing, by the way, since 1945. And here we have the deer in the forest. With the outbreak of World War I in 1914, he was drafted into the Imperial German Army as a cavalryman. Good for him, he liked horses. What is interesting is that by February 1916, he's writing to his wife that he had gravitated to military camouflage. And so his technique for hiding artillery from aerial observation was to paint canvas covers in broadly pointy style. But then he realized that seen from far away, just going in style from Manet to Kandinsky was a better hiding thing than pointies, because seeing from so far, you couldn't see the points. So in 1916, he was promoted to lieutenant and awarded the Iron Cross. But then suddenly the government realized that all these artists that were in the military were more precious for them than for them being in the military. And they started moving them back so that they wouldn't incur any risk. And before that happened, though he was on the list, he was struck in the head and killed instantly by a shell splinter in 1916 in the Battle of Verdun. And so died pretty young, as you can see, was 27. August Macke, who was a friend of Mark, was also an early talent, if you want. And he looked at, his father was making drawings. He was also influenced by Japanese prints and some works by other artists that he was around. In 1904, he went to the Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf, the Academy of Art. But the same thing, he started pushing back because it was too traditional. He had the chance to visit Northern Italy in 1905, and then a trip in 1906 in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Britain. And for him, you know, that's always incredible because they see completely different artists and different period. He spent most of his life in Bonn and then at the Lake Thun in Switzerland. Traveled to Paris in 1907, where he saw the works of the Impressionists, but also, as you know, the Fauvists. And this is an interesting painting where you see that this is his wife, the artist's wife, in a blue hat. It's not Matisse, it's not totally the Fauvist movement that we've seen, but the use of color is quite interesting. He starts his friendship with Franz Marc in 1910, and then will meet Kandinsky and will join their Blauheiter. And here, as you can see, how from that rather realist painting of his wife, he's moving to something definitely more abstracted, where everything is defined by colors and not by line. The Promenade. He will meet Robert Delaunay also in 1912. That's going to be a big revelation. Delaunay with chromatic cubism, what Apollinaire will call Orpheus, but we'll see that next time. Is going to be of great influence on him, and you can see this in the Kairouan. He visited Tunisia, where he was delighted with the kind of light that you have in North Africa. And so has that luminist approach, but with a much more abstracted shapes, if you want. It's just a series of shapes and a display of different colors, so very type of Fauvist. Unfortunately, just as Marc, his career was cut short by his early death in the second months of the First World War in September 1914 in Champagne, France. Very different is Alex von Chalensky. He's a Russian expressionist born in the Tver Governorate in Russia, that's northeast of Moscow. Went to St. Petersburg to study at the Art Academy, moved to Munich in 1894, and started a long friendship with the French painter that you might not remember really well, but he's one of the nabis, Paul Sérusier, that made some, had been taught by Gauguin about using colors more than the line. And so it was really interesting for him. Then we have that interesting grouping of these artists. You have Jolensky, and they meet Kandinsky and Gabriel Münter, who was at that time his companion, and Verhevkin, who is another of the painter, and they work together and they do all kind of experiments. So let's look at a few of his art. This is Alexander Sakharov, and Sakharov is that man that you see here who was a theater person. And so it's quite interesting how you see that figure there with the white, almost that mask, white mask, but he was definitely a director as well as an actor himself. And so talk about expressionist, it's quite wonderful to see that painting there where you can almost imagine what he's going to say. A little bit like Marc during a period where he does variation. There's a very curvy linear, just spots of colors that are juxtaposed. And this variation, it could be influenced by Kandinsky and his music. But then his later works are quite interesting because they're almost like icons, influenced by some Russian icons. Very simplified faces. Here he shows a series of mystical heads, what they call, and this is astonishment. And to the right, the Savior face, martyr. And these are reminiscent of the traditional Russian icons. Unfortunately for him, from 1929 on, he suffered from crippling arthritis and had to finally be forced to stop painting in 1937. Now we have many women in that movement. Gabrielle Münter is quite an interesting one. She was born from upper middle class parents in Berlin, started drawing as a child and had a private tutor, took classes at the women's artist school. Of course, the German academies did not allow women typically. Then she decided to take a trip to America with her sister in 1898. And they stayed in America for over 2 years, mainly in the states of Texas, Arkansas, and Missouri. She, for her age and the generation, had quite an unrestricted life. They had inherited, her sister and her, quite a bit of money, and that gave them a lot of independence. So they attended the Munich Phalanx School, where they studied woodcut techniques, sculpture, painting, and printmaking. Then in summer of 1902, Kandinsky invited Münter to join him at his summer painting class. She accepted, and their relationship became more personal than professional. These things happen, right? And so here are a few of her paintings. She painted on and off, depending where she was in her personal life. And so here's, look at the impasto in that painting. It's so much pigment on that painting. It's amazing. Countryside near Paris, by Paris. So. And a very different work is this one, The Black Mask with Rose. That was more influenced by Matisse and Fauvism, as well as Gauguin and Van Gogh. She became more representative. But she had an extremely busy life. By 1923, she was going to the Staffelsee, so in the south of Germany, went on painting. But again, depending on what her relationship was, first with Kandinsky and then with some others, her output was varied pretty much. Then here is the Dorfstrasse, so the village street in winter, where it becomes very simplified, just almost graphic purely, with some colors. When she was also, of course, and all these painters were influenced by what was happening in Europe at the time, that either the First World War, or then in Russia you had the revolution. In Germany, you had that depression, and this had a tremendous impact on these young people that were much more nervous and depressed because of all the things that happened. Because of what was happening with the condemnation of modernist movement, she had all the artwork done by her, Kandinsky, and the other members of the Blaureiter transported to her house, where she hid them. And in spite of her financial problems, she preserved them with care during the war. And after the war, when they went to try to find them, they were never found. And nobody has any idea where all these works that she had hidden, what happened. So completely disappeared. But her collection, beside the one that she had hidden, was given to the Lenbach House in Munich after her death. Another woman is Marianne von Werefkin. Oh, am I going to say it? She was a Russian, German, Swiss expressionist painter. She was born in the Russian town of Tula. She had private academic drawing lessons at the age of 14 and became a student of Ilya Repin, the famous Russian realist painter, who was the most important at that time, who was teaching in St. Petersburg. Unfortunately for her, she had a hunting accident in 1888 where she accidentally shot her right hand. And for a whole time, she was right-handed, couldn't use her right hand and had to first use her left hand to paint, and then finally, with a lot of exercise, was able to regain her right hand again. She met Alexei von Jalensky that we saw before, became her protege, and moved with him to Munich. She interrupted her paintings for about 10 years, but then started painting again in 1906 and so on. She was the most well-off of all of them. Her family was pretty well-off, except, of course, during the war. This is a painting by Ilya Repin of her portrait. And by the way, I'm going to give next year a talk on Ilya Repin and some of his students. He's very interesting. So talk about, this is totally Fauvist. So there she's really looking at Matisse and the Fauves in Paris. using again the colors that she feels that don't belong to the shape. Self-portrait, very different to Ilya Repin's. And it's quite interesting to see how she works on the shapes. It's almost like a vision, almost like a lens, seen through a lens when you see the curves of these trees. The Fantastic Night, 1917. And the Monk, quite beautiful painting. Denmark. Now, again, another woman, but extremely powerful, is Kate Kollwitz. Kate Kollwitz was born in the city of Königsberg in Prussia in 1867. And again, these women always are facing men's world as far as art is concerned. As you know, the academy wasn't let them in. They really had to climb by themselves with all their strengths. And so she had a very different aesthetic vision. And she's going to look mostly at women and the working class. She is born in a family that is very centered on socialism. Her father, she's going to marry a young man who is a doctor, but who takes care of poor people. So her interest is very much in the suffering of the working class. And her art is incredibly powerful. Mostly, she started by painting and then very quickly realized that she was much better at drawing purely than at painting. And then later on, she's going to take sculpture too. So let's look at a few, because she did a lot. There's a lot of her art being in prints. It has been spread around. You know, it's just one work. You can print in multiple versions. And so we have quite a bit. And she did series. This is The Woman with a Dead Child. It's so powerful when you look at it. It's incredible. She embraces that dead child. You can feel the suffering in her. It's tragic. The grandfather also gave lessons in religion and socialism. She also suffered from anxiety during her childhood due to the death of her siblings. And she might have suffered from a childhood neurological disorder called Alice in Wonderland syndrome, which is associated with migraines and sensory hallucination. And so the idea that she can suffer from that is visible in some of her works. This other work, she did a series on peasants. And here you have the peasant sharpening a scythe with the clear implication that the tool could also serve as a weapon. She was looking at historical happenings in Germany where the peasant revolt in the 17th century and in the 19th century also, and really fell for them. But this is incredibly rich in all the touch. When you know how an etching is done, it's all these fine lines and the coming to these very dark areas. If you look at this, it's just so rich in color. It's black and white, but it's full of color in a sense. All are typically depressive themes. And unfortunately for her, her life is going to be difficult too. This is part of a series on the peasant war. And the title for this one is Rape. And you can guess that silhouette of the woman on her back in the hay. But again, just the incredible way she handles her etchings, it's unbelievable. She, after seeing some results with the old woodcuts style in print, she moved to woodcut print, and this is one of them showing the Mutter, the mothers. You can see all these women that obviously this is in 1922. This is the result of the war. All these mothers that have lost their children. Yes.
If it's a big monument, like nobody's.
Coming.
Oh, is it coming?
Yeah.
Oh.
No, it's okay. So, but you can see again the interest in these phases. And I think I've rarely seen an art that is as powerful as what she can express with these prints. As I mentioned, she turned to sculpture too. Unfortunately for her, she lost her younger son Peter on the battlefield in World War One in October 1914. That prompted a long depression. And so by the end of the year, she had made drawings for a monument to Peter and his fallen comrades. She destroyed the monument in 1919 and began again in 1925. And this is called The Grieving Parents, that was completed and placed in the Belgian cemetery of Hoggevelde in 1932. Then his grave was moved to Vladslo German War Cemetery, and the statues were moved also. But this shows, as you can see, the mother and the father grieving the loss of their child. She also received, and she was dead by then, but after the German reunification, the Neue Wache was again rededicated. It's a building in Berlin in 1993 as the central memorial of the Federal Republic of Germany for the victims of war and dictatorship. This commission happened at the personal suggestion of, if you remember him, the Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who was so the Chancellor of the German Federation at that time. And he wanted this enlargement of Kjell Kotwitz's sculpture be the centerpiece of that place. And so they enlarged the version 4 times to come to this work that is a kind of a Pietà, but very different, where you see the child that is dead, but it's almost like looking for the comfort of the lapse of his mother. And it's, again, extremely powerful. Now, within the building is placed, I'm going to go back. As you can see, there is an oculus at the top that is open air. So which means when it rains, it snows or whatever, it falls on the statue. And it's really showing that you survive if you want, or you die in whatever weather there is. So it's extremely powerful place. And so victims of war and dictatorship. So it's a rather large piece, but it's lost in that large surface. Some other sculptor, this time we're going back to some man. He was an interesting, Ernst Barlach, was a supporter of the war in the years leading to World War One. But then he changed his position dramatically, protesting the war at the end of it. And that created a lot of conflicts during the rise of the Nazi Party, where most of his work were confiscated as degenerate art. He studied from 1888 to 1891 at the Academy in Hamburg, and continued his studies for one more year in Paris and at the Académie Julian, where most of our impressionists went. He remained critical of the German tendency to copy the style of French artists. Then he traveled to Russia also. And his works are quite interesting, where he's paying a lot of attention to the face, but most of the time the body is much more simplified. You don't see draperies or things like that, but you focus on the face. Face and the hands, by the way. So in 1936, his works were confiscated during an exhibition together with the work of Karl Kollwitz and Wilhelm Lehmbruck. And a lot of it was burned down. He was also forbidden to go on sculpting. And he was shunned by his fellow townspeople, was condemned as a Jew, which wasn't true, and a Bolshevik, and he died of heart failure in 1938. Wilhelm Lehmbruck, this is going to be a really short one on him. As you can see, he died very young also, was born in Duisburg, studied sculpture in Düsseldorf, and has a very different style. He's as bulky was the previous one, as Lehmbruck is very lengthy. He married Anita Kaufmann in 1907, had 3 sons, but died again shortly after the war. And these are very different kind of sculpture, very elongated. He lived in Paris from 1910 to 1914, and no surprise, he met Modigliani and Brancusi over there. And so you can see some influence of Modigliani there, and Archipenko also. During the war, he served as paramedic, but the suffering and the misery he saw is quite reflected in many of his sculptures. So after the war, he returned to Berlin, where he committed suicide on March 25th, 1919. So leaving the individual art, we're going to give a little word on the Bauhaus that was founded by Walter Gropius in Weimar because of anxieties about the soullessness of manufacturing in this product. It's almost that same reaction you have in England with Morris and the art and craft. It's the idea that everything being manufactured makes it cold. As you know, I don't know how you are, but for me, I love when I can see the hand of somebody on something that that it is a sculpture or even a plate that you can see slightly irregular. For me, it has a charm. So, and about the art's loss of purpose in society. So literally, construction house is Bauhaus, meant a school of building. It was founded with the idea of creating total work, Gesamtkunstwerk. So it's you have everything, as I mentioned. It's not only the architecture, but it's also the design, the furniture, even the dishes that you're using are supposed to be in harmony with what the house is about. The stress on intellectual and theoretical pursuit, also emphasis on practical skills, crafts, and techniques reminiscent of the medieval guild system, emphasis on experiment and problem solving, influence upon subsequent developments in art, architecture, graphic design, interior design, industrial design, and typography. So it existed in 3 German cities, Weimar, Dessau, and Berlin. 3 different architect directors, Walter Gropius from 1919 to 28, Hannes Meyer from 28 to 30, and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe from 1930 until 33 when it was dismantled. Renowned for its faculty, it employed such incredible names like Kandinsky, Albers, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Paul Klee, Johannes Itten, and designer Marcel Brauer. So the influence, Gropius had a great influence on the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. Mies van der Rohe became director of the College of Architecture, Planning and Design at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Joseph Albers, the Black Mountain College in North Carolina. All these architects are descending from them. So you still have that philosophy quite important. So here's the Bauhaus building in Dessau. As you can see, very simplified form, rationality, functionality. It shows that mass production is reconcilable with the individual artistic spirit. Rational functionalist versus aesthetic program. This is the Gropius Story Hall at the Harvard University. What is interesting is you had some people that were not always following all the line. For example, Meyer generated a great deal of conflict as he was a functionalist and had no patience with aesthetic program. So you have different personality there too. Of course, for us, the most known is Mies van der Rohe, who had tremendous influence in Chicago. There are so many buildings in Chicago that were designed by him, including 860 to 880 Lakeshore Drive, that series of buildings. And you also have the whole administrative group of buildings in the center. Also the new National Gallery building in Berlin. Look at that, you know, that was built in the 50s, and it's so ahead of its time. But he also took care of designing some furniture, and here you see some of the seats that he did that were cantilever chairs that were done in 2930 for the bedroom of that Trickenhut house in Brno. So I see, you know, it's always wonderful to see how very early this came. We always feel, you know, modernists now, 50s, 60s, they were so much ahead of their time then. And it's important to give them the credit for what they did and suffered very much what happened during the wars. I mean, lost their life, were persecuted greatly under Hitler. But we still see the result of what they started inventing. And so next one, we're going to go to the not very easy analytic cubism and try to understand what they were looking for. So thank you very much.